September 19, 1940. The cobblestone streets of Warsaw's Zalibor district glistened with morning frost as German jackboots echoed through the narrow alleys. Inside apartment number 7 at Warsaw Uprising Street, Captain Witold Pilecki sat calmly at his sister-in-law's kitchen table, listening to the approaching chaos of a Nazi roundup. The 39-year-old cavalry officer could have easily slipped away through the building's back entrance, vanishing into the maze of Warsaw's underground tunnels that had sheltered countless Polish resistance fighters. Instead, he remained seated, methodically destroying the last evidence of his true identity. In his pocket lay the identity papers of Tomasz Serafiński, a deceased Polish lawyer whose documents Pilecki had discovered by chance in Dr. Helena Poloska's apartment weeks earlier. What began as a desperate need for false identification had evolved into something far more extraordinary, a deliberate transformation that would make him the first person in history to voluntarily enter a Nazi concentration camp. The plan had been born 2 months earlier during a clandestine meeting in a bombed-out Warsaw basement. Major Jan Lodarkiewicz, Pilecki's commander in the newly formed secret Polish army, had spread disturbing reports across a makeshift table. Polish political prisoners were disappearing into a mysterious camp near the town of Auschwitz, known to the Germans as Auschwitz. Telegrams announcing sudden deaths were arriving at families' homes with suspicious frequency. The Polish underground needed intelligence from within. Lodarkiewicz had looked directly at Pilecki during that meeting, and both men understood without words. The mission required someone with military training, unwavering resolve, and the psychological fortitude to maintain his cover under the most extreme circumstances. Pilecki embodied all three qualities, plus something rarer, an almost mystical sense of duty that transcended personal survival. The morning roundup unfolded exactly as Pilecki had anticipated. German soldiers burst through apartment doors, herding terrified civilians into the courtyard below. When the SS officers reached Eleonora Ostrowska's apartment, they found a middle-aged man claiming to be Tomasz Serafiński, a tanner from Warsaw. His papers appeared authentic, his story believable. They had no reason to suspect they were arresting one of Poland's most dedicated resistance operatives. For 2 days, Pilecki endured brutal interrogations and beatings alongside nearly 2,000 other Polish citizens in the Light Horse Guards barracks. Rubber batons crashed against skulls, German voices screamed accusations, and the stench of fear permeated every corner of the makeshift detention center. Through it all, Pilecki maintained his cover, responding only to the name Serafiński, never betraying his military background or resistance connections. The selection process was arbitrary and terrifying. SS officers moved through the overcrowded barracks like predators choosing prey, pointing at men who would be transported to various camps and prisons throughout the Reich. When a gloved finger pointed at Tomasz Serafiński, Pilecki felt a mixture of relief and dread. His voluntary imprisonment was about to begin. On the night of September 21st, cattle cars packed with human cargo departed Warsaw's rail yards bound for Auschwitz. Inside one of those sealed cars, pressed against dozens of other prisoners in suffocating darkness, Pilecki began the most audacious intelligence mission of World War II. He later wrote in his report, "I left at night, just as I would return. I bade farewell to everything I had hitherto known on this earth, and entered something seemingly no longer of it." As the train wheels clicked against the tracks through the Polish countryside, Pilecki couldn't have imagined that his forbidden mission would produce the first comprehensive eyewitness account of the Holocaust. He was heading toward a place that would transform from a brutal political prison into history's most efficient killing machine, and he would document every horrifying stage of that transformation. The other prisoners in that cattle car saw only another unfortunate victim of Nazi brutality. None suspected they were traveling alongside a man who had deliberately engineered his own capture, who carried within his mind the training and determination to expose the greatest crime in human history. In less than 72 hours, Witold Pilecki would enter Auschwitz as prisoner number 4859, beginning a mission that would ultimately alert the world to the Nazi regime's systematic annihilation of European Jewry, even as that same world chose not to listen. September 23, 1940. The cattle car doors screeched open with a metallic shriek that pierced the morning air at Auschwitz station. After 2 days of suffocating darkness, the sudden burst of daylight temporarily blinded the 1,705 Polish prisoners who had been packed like livestock into the fetid cars. SS guards screamed orders in German while unleashing their dogs, creating a chaos of barking, shouting, and terror that would become the soundtrack of hell. Among the confused mass of humanity stumbling onto the platform stood Tomasz Serafiński, prisoner number 4859. Pilecki's trained military eye immediately assessed his surroundings: the high-voltage barbed wire, the machine gun towers, the methodical brutality of the guards. This was no ordinary prison. The Germans had constructed something unprecedented, a factory of human destruction disguised as a detention facility. The first stage of dehumanization began immediately. Guards herded the new arrivals through the infamous gate bearing the cynical inscription, Arbeit macht frei. Work makes you free. The irony was not lost on Pilecki, who understood that very few would ever walk back through that gate as free men. They were pushed into a large courtyard where SS officers conducted the initial selection, separating those who appeared capable of slave labor from those marked for immediate execution. The registration process that followed was designed to strip away every vestige of human identity. Pilecki watched as prisoners were forced to surrender their final possessions: photographs of loved ones, wedding rings, religious items that had sustained them through the darkest moments of occupation. These personal treasures were cataloged and stored in warehouses that prisoners would later nickname Canada, imagining it as a land of plenty where their stolen lives awaited. Inside the prisoner reception building, the transformation from human being to numbered commodity accelerated. Pilecki stood naked with hundreds of other men, their bodies exposed and vulnerable as camp functionaries. Prisoners who had been broken and conscripted into serving their captors filled out detailed registration forms. Every physical characteristic was noted: height, weight, distinguishing marks, even the shape of ears. The SS demanded absolute precision in their record-keeping, as if meticulous documentation could legitimize the atrocities they were committing. When Pilecki's turn came, he maintained his false identity flawlessly. The prisoner scribe dutifully recorded Tomasz Serafiński on the halfling's personnel card, the prisoner personal card that would follow him throughout his imprisonment. The number 4859 was permanently inked onto his left forearm using a crude needle and India ink, the pain sharp but brief compared to what lay ahead. This tattoo marked him as one of the first prisoners to receive such identification. The practice had only recently been introduced for Soviet POWs and would later expand to all inmates. The physical degradation continued with methodical efficiency. Guards shaved every hair from the prisoners' bodies, ostensibly for hygiene, but actually to further their psychological destruction. The striped uniform that replaced their civilian clothes was deliberately ill-fitting and degrading, designed to make its wearer appear less than human. Pilecki later wrote that this moment marked the complete transformation from a free citizen into a camp slave. The living conditions that awaited them defied comprehension. 20 brick barracks, originally designed as Polish army quarters, had been hastily modified to hold up to 1,200 prisoners, each despite being intended for fewer than 700. During those first months, there were no beds, only straw mattresses spread across bare floors where men slept pressed together in rows, barely able to turn over without disturbing their neighbors. The stench of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair permeated every corner of the overcrowded buildings. Water was scarce and contaminated. 2 wells served the entire camp, and prisoners had strictly limited access to washing facilities. Within days, skin diseases erupted among the population. Scabies, boils, and infected wounds became commonplace as malnutrition weakened immune systems and poor sanitation created perfect breeding conditions for disease. Lice infested every barracks, spreading typhus that would later claim thousands of lives. The daily routine was calculated torture. Before dawn, a gong awakened the prisoners for their meager breakfast: half a liter of bitter coffee substitute or herbal tea, with no food. Roll call followed, forcing inmates to stand motionless in rows of 10 regardless of weather while SS officers counted and recounted, sometimes for hours. Guards used these assemblies as opportunities for random punishment: beatings for missing buttons, detention for improperly cleaned bowls, or forced squatting with arms raised until prisoners collapsed. The work assignments were deliberately designed to break both body and spirit. 11-hour shifts in construction sites, gravel pits, and lumber yards left exhausted men barely able to stumble back to their barracks. No rest periods were permitted. Even bodily functions were timed and regulated, with one prisoner assigned to each latrine to monitor how long workers took to relieve themselves. The cruel irony of a camp orchestra playing cheerful music as broken men marched to their labor assignments added another layer of psychological torment. For Pilecki, these brutal conditions represented both challenge and opportunity. While other prisoners focused solely on survival, he began studying the camp structure, identifying potential allies, and planning the intelligence network that would eventually expose Auschwitz to the world. His military training allowed him to recognize that the camp's organization, while terrifying, also contained vulnerabilities that a skilled operative could exploit. As autumn turned to winter in 1940, Pilecki witnessed the true evolution of Auschwitz from a harsh prison into something far more sinister. The mortality rate soared as diseases spread unchecked. Bodies were removed daily from the barracks, creating a grim routine that the SS documented with the same bureaucratic precision they applied to everything else. Through it all, prisoner 4859 maintained his cover while beginning the most dangerous intelligence mission of the war. What Pilecki couldn't yet know was that he had arrived at the precise moment when Auschwitz was transforming from a concentration camp into the epicenter of the Nazi genocide. The nightmare was only beginning, and he would document every horrifying stage of its development. October 1940. In the suffocating darkness of Block 17A, Pilecki lay pressed between two dying men, their ragged breathing marking time in a world where survival was measured in hours rather than days. The number 4859 had become his entire identity within Auschwitz's brutal hierarchy. But beneath that dehumanizing designation, the mind of a Polish cavalry officer continued to function with military precision. While other prisoners struggled simply to endure each dawn, Pilecki was already studying the camp's organizational structure, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited by a trained intelligence operative. The prisoner hierarchy that governed daily existence was as rigid as it was cruel. At the apex stood the lateral test, camp elder, a German criminal prisoner who wielded absolute authority over the inmate population on behalf of the SS. Below him, a network of Blockhaltist-controlled individual barracks, each ruling their domain through a combination of violence and favoritism. These prisoner functionaries, known as Funktionschafling, represented roughly 10% of the camp population and held the power of life and death over their fellow inmates. Pilecki quickly recognized that survival in Auschwitz required more than physical endurance. It demanded a sophisticated understanding of the camp's social dynamics. The Kapo system, imported from earlier concentration camps like Dachau, had transformed certain prisoners into willing instruments of SS oppression. These supervisors, marked by special armbands and slightly better rations, drove work details with clubs and whips, their brutality often exceeding that of the German guards themselves. The psychology was devastatingly effective. By forcing prisoners to brutalize each other, the SS created a system where resistance seemed impossible and solidarity became a luxury few could afford. The camp's physical structure reflected this calculated dehumanization. Rudolf Haas, the 40-year-old commandant who had transformed a former Polish army barracks into this machinery of death, operated from his comfortable villa just beyond the camp's perimeter. The Austrian-born SS officer approached mass murder with bureaucratic efficiency, viewing the systematic destruction of human beings as an administrative challenge to be solved through proper organization and technological innovation. His meticulous records documented every aspect of camp operations, from daily mortality rates to the optimal caloric intake required to maintain slave labor productivity. For Pilecki, Haas represented both the primary target of intelligence gathering and the greatest threat to his mission's success. The commandant's methodical nature meant that any prisoner who attracted attention faced immediate investigation and likely death. Yet the same systematic approach that made Haas dangerous also created opportunities for a skilled operative. The vast bureaucracy required to operate Auschwitz generated countless documents, reports, and communications that a strategically placed prisoner might access. The daily routine that autumn was designed to break both body and spirit through relentless psychological pressure. Dawn brought the dreaded Appellplatz, roll call, where thousands of prisoners stood motionless in precise rows while SS officers counted and recounted, often for hours regardless of weather. Guards used these assemblies as opportunities for random punishment and public executions, hanging resistors from makeshift gallows as a warning to others. The message was clear: submission was the only path to temporary survival. Work assignments determined each prisoner's life expectancy. The stone quarry at Gulzo meant certain death within weeks. Construction details building camp expansions offered slightly better odds, but demanded backbreaking labor under the constant threat of capo violence. The coveted indoor positions, kitchen duty, clerical work, medical assistance, required either extraordinary luck or connections with the prisoner elite. Pilecki understood that gaining access to these privileged assignments would be essential for his intelligence mission. The camp's medical facilities provided a particularly horrifying glimpse into Nazi ideology. The so-called hospital was actually a sorting station where SS doctors conducted selections, determining which patients might recover quickly enough to return to work and which should be killed immediately through lethal injections. Disease ran rampant through the overcrowded barracks. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis claiming dozens of lives daily. Pilecki later noted that witnessing these medical murders convinced him that Auschwitz represented something unprecedented in human history, a systematic attempt to industrialize death itself. Despite the overwhelming brutality, Pilecki began identifying potential allies within the prisoner population. Military experience proved invaluable in recognizing others who possessed the discipline and psychological resilience necessary for resistance work. Former Polish army officers, police personnel, and experienced political activists could be approached cautiously, their backgrounds verified through careful observation and indirect questioning. The challenge lay in distinguishing genuine resistance prospects from potential informants or prisoners who had been psychologically broken by their ordeal. The constant threat of discovery made every interaction fraught with danger. Prisoners suspected of organizing resistance faced immediate execution, often following brutal interrogations designed to extract information about other conspirators. The SS had developed sophisticated techniques for monitoring prisoner communications, using informants and hidden microphones to detect unauthorized conversations. Even apparently innocent friendships could be interpreted as evidence of conspiracy. Yet Pilecki pressed forward with his mission, driven by an understanding that the world needed to know what was happening inside Auschwitz. The initial reports reaching the Polish underground suggested a harsh but conventional concentration camp. None described the systematic murder, medical experiments, and unprecedented cruelty that Pilecki witnessed daily. His reports would need to convey not just statistical information about mortality rates and camp conditions, but the fundamental transformation in human behavior that Auschwitz represented. As winter approached, Pilecki began laying the groundwork for what would become the most comprehensive intelligence network ever established within a Nazi concentration camp. The work required extraordinary patience and psychological fortitude, as one miscalculation could result not only in his own death, but in the torture and execution of every prisoner associated with him. Prisoner 4859 was about to become something far more dangerous than the Nazis could imagine, the first witness capable of exposing their greatest crime to the outside world. But first, he would need to survive long enough to build his network, and as autumn turned to winter in 1940, that survival was far from guaranteed. In the shadow of Auschwitz's smokestacks, the human spirit refused to suffocate. From his first days in Block 17, Witold Pilecki began what would become a legendary effort, constructing a secret resistance organization within the most heavily guarded Nazi stronghold in Europe. The goal was both audacious and simple: give hope to the condemned, gather intelligence, and, if possible, spark a revolt that could free those who had all but lost the world's attention. Pilecki's Fellowship of Resistance started with a handful of Polish army officers and trusted tap contacts, men whose courage matched his own. This was the birth of the Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZOW, the Military Organization Union, a clandestine network structured meticulously to remain undetected by the SS machine. The system operated via fives, unique cells where each of the 5 members knew only their own slice of the operation. Should one cell fail or be exposed, the rest would persist, protecting both secrets and lives. The first, High Five, included Dr. the Ladislaw Deering, Lieutenant Colonel the Ladislaw Sermacki, Captain Jerzy de Virion, Eugenius Obotsky, and Roman Zagner, all experienced resistors with nerves honed for war. From this nucleus, ZOW expanded rapidly. By 1942, over 500 members had infiltrated the camp's fabric, spreading hope and information in places ranging from prisoner records to hospital wards and the notorious Sonderkommando units responsible for burning the dead. Each cell had critical roles. Some boosted morale with news from the outside, some distributed precious scraps of food and medicine, and others secured false diagnoses on medical cards, ensuring comrades avoided the gas chambers for as long as possible. The camp's records office, hospital block, prisoner workshops, and supply warehouses became secret battlegrounds for information and survival. Even the SS administration offices and the Erkennungsdienst identification unit were infiltrated, where photographs and lists quietly disappeared into resistance hands. Smuggling intelligence back to the Polish underground was paramount. At first, this meant risky escapes, every fugitive both a carrier of news and a symbol of possibility. However, by 1942, ZOW's ingenuity had produced a homemade radio transmitter, its parts gathered and assembled under constant threat of summary execution. From the basement of a hospital block, Pilecki's voice reached Warsaw and London, describing the accelerating genocide in real time, listing arrivals and deaths, and documenting the Nazi system's evolving cruelty. ZOW did more than distribute news. It enforced its own underground discipline. A clandestine court allowed prisoners to adjudicate matters of justice, maintaining order and morale in an environment ripe for betrayal. Through this multi-pronged network, the organization made its mark, assuring that Nazi efforts at isolation would not succeed. News, aid, and secret preparation for revolt coursed through the camp, changing the fate of hundreds who otherwise faced certain death. Yet, every victory was shadowed by peril. As Pilecki expanded his network, Gestapo efforts to crack ZOW grew just as ruthless. Prisoners disappeared overnight. Entire cells vanished or were executed after the SS stormed suspected barracks. In response, Pilecki became ever more careful, reorganizing cells, changing communication pipelines, and ensuring no member knew more than they needed to survive. By spring 1942, ZOW's reach extended across major subcamps, with members from other nationalities and, increasingly, Jews whose risk was highest, but whose drive to resist remained undiminished. Contacts with the Home Army and Polish government in exile strengthened external support, while civilians nearby became sources for medical supplies and escape routes. In these darkest halls, Pilecki and ZOW built a framework for hope, a defiant testament to the endurance of humanity when all other light seemed lost. Their achievements not only laid the groundwork for future escape, but ensured that the world would, eventually, hear Auschwitz's true story, a story impossible to silence. It began with a whisper and ended with a desperate plea, hidden in the folds of prisoners' clothing or memorized by the only men courageous enough to attempt escape. By October 1940, Witold Pilecki and the ZOW had established the means to relay first-hand accounts of Auschwitz to the Polish Home Army, the world's earliest witness to the camp's lethal reality. Pilecki's initial report, sent out with a released inmate, described not only unbearable violence, but the unrelenting starvation and psychological torture that defined daily life. The first accounts reached Warsaw in fragments of memory, a description of roll calls dragging on for hours, prisoners collapsing from exhaustion and not rising again, the endlessly creative brutality of capos. Some survivors, after daring escapes aided by outsiders, carried these accounts further, risking their own lives to transmit the truth to anyone who would listen. By early 1941, the Polish government in exile in London held in its hands one of history's greatest and grimmest testimonies. Pilecki's documentation described the systematic extermination of political prisoners, the savage experiments conducted on Soviet POWs, and the first rumors of gas chambers, all long before much of Europe would even recognize Auschwitz as a death camp. These facts were not guesses, but the product of systematic eyewitness observation and coordinated intelligence work delivered by ZOW's growing chain. Pilecki's network relayed astonishing details: a clandestine radio built by prisoners, broadcasting counts of daily arrivals and deaths, and warning of soon-to-be mass murder. At first, reports traveled through escapees like Stanislav Jaster, who in June 1942 became the first courier to deliver a full account to Warsaw after stealing SS uniforms and a staff car to escape the camp. This was not only a story of courage, but a channel for messages describing the possibilities and limitations of resistance from within. Such early testimonies, both verbal and written, included requests for outside aid, proposals for an armed revolt, and entreaties for the Allies to bomb the camp or organize rescue missions. But while these messages found sympathetic ears among the Polish Home Army and the government in exile, they were met with both logistical impossibility and strategic skepticism. The outside world, overwhelmed by the enormity of the Nazi machinery and the risk to tens of thousands of prisoners, did not launch the assault that Pilecki and ZOW hoped for. Pilecki's narrative, compiled after his escape in April 1943, included the first verified accounts of industrial-scale murder, eyewitness descriptions of gas chambers, deliberate starvation, and sterilization experiments on Roma and Seni prisoners. It was, and remains, the earliest comprehensive record delivered to the Western Allies about Auschwitz's true nature, a warning authored by a man who had seen hell on earth and was determined that no future should ever repeat it. These first testimonies, relayed by escapees, trusted couriers, and homemade radio, became the foundation for the world's understanding of the Holocaust mechanisms. They embodied what the camp's prisoners risked everything to assure: that someone, somewhere, would hear and believe their story. Hashtag Part 5. First Testimonies. In the autumn chill of 1940, the first warnings from Auschwitz slipped through to a world utterly unprepared for their contents. Pilecki's earliest dispatch filtered out via released prisoners, smuggled into the hands of the Polish Home Army in Warsaw, then relayed steadily westward. These were not coded sabotage orders or optimistic appeals. They were raw pieces of hell, relentless violence, relentless starvation, and a rising tide of deaths, with no sign that the outside world was prepared to intervene. Every escape carried more than a body. It carried a memory. The networks built by ZOW allowed reports to be entrusted to men who, by luck or courage, found themselves outside the camp's walls. Details proliferated, roll calls lasting hours, bodies left to freeze, unimaginable brutality by capos and SS overseers. For the Polish underground and then the government in exile in London, these notes provided the first systematic witness to industrialized murder. Beginning in November 1940, information on genocide reached London. By spring 1941, the evidence became overwhelming as accounts of gas chambers, mass shootings, and forced starvation rolled in. The testimonials multiplied in methods and urgency. By 1942, ZOW's resourcefulness had produced Poland's most vital radio transmission, messages sent directly from inside Auschwitz to Warsaw and London, listing arrivals, deaths, and Nazi tactics in real time. Each escape was a new testimony, like the daring flight by Stanislav Jaster and 3 comrades, who stole SS uniforms and a staff car to deliver Pilecki's full report to Warsaw, at a time when precious few outside had any detailed knowledge of the camp. What these first testimonies described, above all, was a camp rapidly evolving into history's most efficient killing machine. Pilecki's own escape and his subsequent 1943 report documented gas chambers, medical experiments, and relentless extermination. He wrote as a witness, not as a theorist, and his accounts remain the earliest comprehensive evidence to reach the Allies. Yet as reports appealed for Allied intervention, a bombing raid or a raid to free prisoners, no action came. There was doubt, skepticism, and logistical impossibility, and ZOW's pleas for outside aid were met with silence or indecision. By risking everything for a fragment of truth, Auschwitz escapees forged testimonies that shaped world knowledge of the Holocaust. They became the world's first witnesses, not only to horror, but to the enduring need to remember and believe. By early 1942, Auschwitz was undergoing a transformation that marked a sinister new chapter in the Holocaust. Initially established as a concentration camp to imprison political opponents, resistance fighters, and undesirables, its primary function was forced labor and punishment. But as the Nazi leadership formalized the final solution at the January 1942 Wannsee Conference, Auschwitz shifted decisively into the role of death camp on an industrial scale. The arrival of first all-Jewish transports in early 1942 signaled this grim new reality. These prisoners were no longer viewed as laborers or political prisoners, but as victims to be exterminated. Upon arrival, in a process known as selection, SS doctors swiftly separated those capable of forced labor from the vast majority condemned to immediate death. Men, women, and children deemed unfit, including the very young, elderly, pregnant women, and the infirm, were sent directly to the gas chambers without registration. This marked a devastating escalation from previous months, when selections were less systematic and killings less efficient. The Nazis' technological innovation and mass murder also advanced rapidly at Auschwitz. Following earlier experiments with carbon monoxide gas on Soviet POWs, they began employing Zyklon B, a cyanide-based fumigant previously used for delousing, as a method of killing large numbers of prisoners in sealed gas chambers. By late 1942 and into 1943, these chambers were operating at full capacity in the Birkenau camp, designed specifically for extermination, where as many as 6,000 victims could be gassed daily. This mechanized slaughter was accompanied by growing medical experimentation within the camp's hospitals. SS doctors conducted cruel trials on prisoners, seeking to further Nazi racial ideology under the guise of science. Prisoners were subjected to sterilization experiments, exposure to extreme temperatures, and infectious diseases, all without anesthesia or mercy. The arrival platforms, known as ramps, became the terrifying epicenter of this new phase. Families were brutally divided, often never to see one another again. The sight of men and boys being led into one line, women and children into another, often did not foreshadow survival, but the immediate fate of death in gas chambers. From 1943 onwards, selections took place openly before thousands of prisoners, a psychological weapon intended to spread fear and submission. For Witold Pilecki and his underground network, the shift was catastrophic. Earlier reports of harsh conditions and widespread death became overshadowed by the systematic genocide now in full operation. The stakes for resistance became immeasurably higher as millions were transported to the camp to face almost certain death upon arrival. Despite the escalating horror, the ZOW continued its determination to document and resist. Pilecki's reports chronicled not just the existence of gas chambers, but the processes of mass murder unfolding daily. His writings capture the indescribable horror of a camp no longer solely a prison, but an execution factory, where industrial precision met unthinkable cruelty. By mid-1942, Auschwitz had become the most lethal symbol of the Nazi regime's genocidal ambitions, a place where millions would perish. For those imprisoned, each day was a struggle not only to survive, but to bear witness, to ensure their suffering would not be forgotten or denied. In the oppressive shadows of Auschwitz, silence seemed the only companion, but beneath that silence, a network of hope and defiance thrived. Witold Pilecki and his underground comrades understood that information was more than knowledge. It was a weapon capable of piercing the veil of Nazi secrecy and mobilizing the outside world. Faced with near-constant surveillance and brutal Gestapo interrogations, the resistance developed ingenious means to communicate messages beyond the barbed wire. Coded texts were slipped into packages, hidden within the stitches of clothing, and concealed in laundry sent to nearby towns. Secret letters reached Polish resistance groups, relaying chilling details of starvation, forced labor, medical experiments, and the fate of thousands murdered in gas chambers. Many of these secret correspondences were destined for the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, and the Polish government in exile in London, where they were analyzed, photocopied, and used to inform Allied powers of the heinous atrocities underway. Among the most remarkable finds are original camp secret messages recovered from kitchen shafts and hidden compartments. Documents once thought lost, revealing the courage and persistence of those who risked everything for truth. The use of coded language was critical to bypassing the camp's strict censorship. Prisoners involved in resistance adopted agreed phrases or double meanings in letters to families, such as stating, "I am very, very healthy," to mean the opposite, to silently convey the dire situation inside without arousing suspicion. Even when writing to loved ones unaware of resistance activities, prisoners embedded clues and concealed warnings, hoping to inspire help or at least ensure their stories were preserved. Beyond letters, the ZOW also built one of the few clandestine radios inside the camp, assembled from smuggled or scavenged parts over 7 laborious months. From hidden basements, these transmissions relayed daily statistics of arrivals and deaths, descriptions of German guard atrocities, and the construction of new crematoria. Despite the risks, this radio was a lifeline, delivering messages to Warsaw and onward to London, demanding urgent Allied intervention. However, the Gestapo was relentless in combating any form of resistance communication. Discovery of secret messages led to fierce reprisals, arrests, torture, imprisonment in the dreaded Block 11, and often death. The camp's security continually revamped its surveillance methods, monitoring movement, correspondence, and liaison identities, making clandestine communication a deadly gamble for all involved. Yet, the prisoners' commitment to transmitting their reality never wavered. Messages in the dark became a testament to their resilience and determination to ensure that the world beyond those walls would one day confront the truth of Auschwitz, untouched by Nazi lies and propaganda. Ultimately, these covert communications shaped global understanding of the Holocaust and underscored the essential human drive to resist even in the face of annihilation. Between 1940 and 1943, the truth about Auschwitz, its sheer scale of brutality and mass murder, was steadily uncovered by courageous insiders like Witold Pilecki and relayed in painstaking detail to the Polish underground and the Allied governments in London. Yet the world outside Auschwitz's barbed wire responded with a deafening silence that would come to define one of the darkest moral failures of World War II. Despite reports beginning as early as October 1940, describing systematic starvation, executions, and the disappearance of thousands, Allied leaders struggled to grasp the industrial magnitude of Nazi atrocities. Intelligence intercepts and eyewitness accounts confirmed the existence of camps used not only for forced labor, but for the calculated extermination of millions. Yet decision-makers treated these revelations with skepticism or regarded them as simply another horror of war to be endured until victory was secured. Witold Pilecki personally communicated with the Polish government in exile, reporting the installation of gas chambers and the escalation of the killing program from his clandestine radio and eyewitness observations. His urgent pleas for bombing the camp or the deportation railways, or for an armed uprising by the Polish Home Army, went largely unanswered. Political realities and anti-Polish biases influenced the reception of these communications. British officials, including Winston Churchill, viewed Poland as an unruly foreign ally, and skepticism about the feasibility and risks of such actions restrained any direct intervention. Allied air forces had the capability to target Auschwitz and its connections, and reconnaissance flights photographed the camp as early as 1944. However, military priorities centered on defeating Germany's armed forces and strategic industries deferred any plans to bomb the camp itself. Concerns about killing prisoners and the high imprecision of bombing raids further justified inaction. Even Jewish leaders' requests to strike railway lines fell on deaf ears or were subordinated to larger war aims, delaying any meaningful action to disrupt the Nazi death machine. Righteous voices like Jan Karski, an early eyewitness who risked his life to reveal the atrocities at the Warsaw Ghetto and the camps, found their warnings dismissed or ignored by top political leaders, including British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden and U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who reportedly responded with disbelief or devastating indifference. Karski later described how the world's indifference haunted him for decades. In this grim context, the work of Pilecki and the Polish underground stands as a testament to courage and truth amidst widespread denial and political paralysis. His smuggled reports, which charted Auschwitz's evolution into an industrial killing center, remain some of the earliest and most detailed documentation of Nazi genocide. Yet it took until Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945 for this truth to be fully confirmed and universally acknowledged. The moral and strategic failures to act sooner on these testimonies highlight the tragic complexities of wartime choices. They force reflection on the limits of intelligence, the costs of political calculus, and the imperative of bearing witness so that silence never again enables such horror. Pilecki's mission to inform the world, though initially unheard, ultimately became a cornerstone of Holocaust history and a powerful reminder of the price of indifference. From the darkest abyss of Auschwitz emerged a complex web of resistance that stretched far beyond the camp's fences, transforming isolated prisoners into a coordinated force that echoed the broader struggle across occupied Europe. Witold Pilecki's military organization union, Związek Organizacji Wojskowych, ZOW, founded in late 1940, was the cornerstone of this network, a secret army within hell itself, bound by loyalty, discipline, and purpose. ZOW's connections extended directly to the Polish Home Army, Armia Krajowa, AK, the primary resistance force in Nazi-occupied Poland and the military arm of the Polish government in exile in London. Pilecki maintained secret communication channels with Warsaw, clandestinely transmitting reports that documented the camp's evolution from brutal prison to extermination factory. These reports became crucial intelligence for the Allies and fueled Polish efforts to keep the world informed of Nazi atrocities. Within the camp, ZOW's reach gradually expanded to encompass prisoners from diverse political and national backgrounds. Poles were the original core, but by 1942 Jewish, Czech, Russian, French, Austrian, and other prisoners formed their own cells or allied with existing groups. Even communist resistance activists, often marginalized in post-war accounts, played a role in this international solidarity, coordinating efforts with leftist groups inside and outside Auschwitz. The network's remit was broad. Prisoner functionaries were carefully disciplined by ZOW to prevent abuses. False documents and medical diagnoses were issued to protect vulnerable inmates from selections, and a covert communication system allowed messages and supplies to flow across barracks and even to the outside world. Importantly, ZOW orchestrated many of the earliest and most daring escape attempts, each fugitive a living witness carrying critical intelligence back to the Allied command. This underground movement also forged a unified front in the camp's darkest moments. In the summer of 1944, the Auschwitz Military Council formed, consolidating Polish and other resistance factions to organize self-defense against Nazi reprisal and prepare for the camp's liberation. Though a large-scale uprising inside the camp never materialized, dependent on external military support that never arrived, smaller revolts, such as the Sonderkommandos revolt in October 1944, offered potent symbols of defiance. Communication with the Polish Home Army was vital and vulnerable. Early reports sent by escaping prisoners or smuggled letters formed the backbone of ZOW's intelligence efforts. In 1942, a homemade radio transmitter emerged as a breakthrough, allowing Pilecki's men to send near real-time reports of deportations, killings, and camp conditions, a milestone in wartime espionage and resistance. But the Gestapo's relentless hunt for resistance members was an ever-present threat. Discovery of ZOW cells meant torture and execution for members and crackdowns on communication lines. The need for secrecy led to compartmentalization within networks and constant vigilance against informants, a deadly game that the resistance played with lives on the line. The story of ZOW, the Kampfgruppe Auschwitz, and Allied resistance movements is one of extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance. These networks not only kept the flame of hope alive for prisoners, but ensured the world would eventually hear Auschwitz's true story, proving that even in the darkest places, the human will to resist remains unbroken. Winter 1942-43 brought a merciless new test of endurance to Auschwitz's prisoners. Freezing cold intertwined with starvation and disease pushed inmates to the brink of human existence. The barracks, cold and overcrowded beyond design, became tombs without heat or proper bedding. Prisoners, already weakened from relentless forced labor, faced frostbite and exhaustion. Nights were spent wrapped in ration-thin striped uniforms, desperate for warmth and cough relief. Food rations were meager and degrading. A single loaf of black bread, sometimes divided among 4 men, a spoonful of margarine or sparse horse meat, a diluted soup of dubious nutrition. Many prisoners, including those working the hardest jobs, experienced rapid weight loss and the insidious symptoms of starvation sickness: diarrhea, swelling, impaired vision, and a weakening immune system that left them vulnerable to epidemics like typhus and dysentery. Hunger gnawed relentlessly with a ferocity that blurred the line between desperation and madness. For Witold Pilecki, the physical suffering was compounded by a brutal psychological toll. In his secret report years later, he described the profound crisis of will that gripped him in these months, a dangerous mental state where doubts about the purpose of resistance threatened to break his spirit. To have doubts about the sense of fighting means to break down, he wrote. Yet in that despair, he found a source of renewed strength, oscillating between moments of joy for comradeship and the grim reality of their situation. Punishments for infractions or suspected disobedience only deepened the desperation. Starvation as a direct method of execution was employed sporadically to punish escape attempts or resistance actions, holding hostages in dark cells until they starved to death or were killed by lethal injections. The martyrdom of figures like Maximilian Kolbe, who volunteered to die in place of another prisoner, became poignant symbols of sacrifice amidst the abyss. Medical facilities, already overwhelmed by sickness, became scenes of unchecked cruelty. Rather than healing, they were places of death by neglect, experimentation, or orchestrated selections. Ill prisoners languished from diseases such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, and scabies which thrived in the camp's unsanitary conditions. Starvation sickness frequently caused rapid wasting and collapse, and many prisoners died from the combined effects of malnutrition and infection. Daily life was punctuated by routines that mocked the prisoner's suffering. Roll calls lasted hours in below-freezing weather, during which prisoners stood motionless, risking collapse. Work details drained what little energy remained, and denial of even basic hygiene increased illness and despair. The minimal sleeping space, the lice infestations, and the constant threat of executions formed a psychological cage that was even harder to endure than physical hardship. Despite these breaking points, Pilecki's report reveals a desperate, unwavering determination to survive, not for survival's sake alone, but to continue the resistance and bear witness. His leadership within the underground union provided a bulwark against despair, spreading news, distributing meager extra supplies, and nurturing clandestine hope amid some of the worst conditions in human history. Winter was a crucible that tested every prisoner's will. Pilecki's perseverance during this period stands as both a human miracle and a testimony to resilience, an echo of defiance in a place intended to silence every voice. The breaking point was near, but the fight was only just beginning. April 26, 1943. After almost 3 years of clandestine resistance, Witold Pilecki reached a desperate conclusion. The time for survival had passed. The time for action had come. The Gestapo under SS-Untersturmführer Maximilian Grabner was intensifying its purge of ZOW members, executing prisoners and dismantling underground cells, a direct threat to Pilecki's mission and life. To save both, and to deliver his first-hand intelligence directly to the outside world, Pilecki planned a daring escape from the camp. That night, Pilecki secured an assignment on the camp bakery's night shift, located just outside the Nazi fences. Along with 2 trusted comrades, Jan Redzig and Edward Shishelski, he executed a meticulously planned breakout. After hours spent struggling to open a locked metal door and a tense moment monitoring the movements of 2 inattentive SS guards, they sprang into motion. One guard was overpowered, the telephone line was severed to prevent alarm, and the trio slipped through the dark woodshed into freedom, leaving the guards barricaded inside. Gunfire erupted as alarms blared. 9 shots fired toward the fleeing prisoners missed as they bolted into the night. Under a starry sky and the sting of April's chill, Pilecki later described feeling a hit of chilly breeze on heated heads, a visceral relief after years in captivity. They navigated through forests and villages, aided by sympathetic locals who risked their lives to shelter the fugitives. After days on foot, Pilecki reached a safe house near Bognia, owned by the real Tomasz Serafiński, whose identity he had assumed nearly 3 years prior to enter Auschwitz. This coincidence underscored the depth of risk woven into his entire mission. Eventually, they made contact with the Polish Home Army leadership in Warsaw, where Pilecki delivered detailed reports describing Auschwitz's transformation into an extermination camp, the mass murders, the gas chambers, the brutal hierarchy, and the resilience of the underground network. Despite his appeals for an armed uprising and Allied intervention, the Polish military command hesitated, constrained by the realities of war and the Allies' reluctance to commit resources to a remote camp deep in enemy territory. Undeterred, Pilecki continued to serve in the resistance, eventually fighting in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The Great Escape, observed in hindsight, was not merely about Pilecki's personal survival. It was a strategic thunderclap intended to awaken the world, carrying inside the man who had witnessed unspeakable atrocities and whose voice became the first to carry Auschwitz's truth beyond Nazi walls. This escape marked the climax of his forbidden mission and the beginning of a new phase in the battle for truth and justice, where smuggled reports evolved into public testimony, refusing to let the world remain silent any longer. By late 1944, the shadows lengthened over Auschwitz with an urgency born of impending collapse. The Soviet Red Army's relentless westward push meant that the Nazi command knew the end was near, and with it came a frantic effort to cover up the scale of atrocities. The gas chambers operated at maximum capacity, especially processing over 400,000 Hungarian Jews in the summer of 1944, striving to annihilate evidence of genocide before liberation. As winter deepened, Auschwitz saw desperate evacuations. SS guards forced tens of thousands of prisoners onto death marches. Grueling treks in freezing conditions meant to clear the camp of inmates before the Soviet arrival. Many perished en route, shot if they faltered, buried in snow, or gave up under exhaustion. Among them were countless families broken apart, and survivors bound by trauma that would mark them for life. For Witold Pilecki, now free but undeterred, the race against time was not only to warn but to organize resistance in occupied Poland. After escaping Auschwitz in April 1943, he rejoined the Polish Home Army and fought in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, embodying the relentless struggle against Nazi domination. The intelligence he helped deliver on Auschwitz informed the resistance's understanding of enemy crimes and reinforced the drive to reclaim their country. Inside the camp, conditions deteriorated further. Food shortages, disease outbreaks, and overcrowding created a humanitarian catastrophe. The inmates who remained behind faced imminent death, either from starvation, execution, or the brutal toll of relentless forced labor. But hope flickered persistently amidst this darkness. Underground networks maintained communication, distributed aid, and planned for liberation and justice. Allied forces, advancing across Europe, planned the final strokes to defeat Nazi Germany, but Auschwitz's liberation was largely incidental, an outcome of the Soviet offensive rather than a targeted military objective. When the Red Army arrived on January 27, 1945, they found a sight of unimaginable horrors. Thousands of surviving prisoners on the verge of death, piles of corpses, and warehouses full of confiscated personal belongings bearing witness to the mass extermination. Racing against time meant not only fighting the Nazis, but preserving memory. The testimony from Pilecki and countless other survivors ensured that Auschwitz's story would outlive its walls. Their courage in the face of near-certain death became a beacon for future generations, a reminder that even at history's darkest hour, resistance and hope endure. Following his dramatic escape from Auschwitz in April 1943, Witold Pilecki wasted no time preparing what would become one of the most important and haunting documents of World War II, Rapport W, or Pilecki's report. This comprehensive record, compiled with fellow Polish underground operatives, detailed the full scope of the atrocities unfolding inside the camp, from systematic mass murder in the gas chambers to brutal medical experiments and extermination through slave labor and starvation. Pilecki's report was sent to the Polish Home Army Intelligence Service and then relayed to the Polish government in exile in London. His vivid eyewitness account described the mechanized efficiency of Auschwitz's killing apparatus, including the existence of 3 crematoria capable of incinerating 8,000 bodies daily. The report underscored the unprecedented nature of the Holocaust, emphasizing the camp as a center of extermination, with meticulous German bureaucracy devoted to genocide. The Polish government in exile took the report seriously and used it to inform Allied governments and the international community. They published diplomatic notes and annexes in 1941 and later, which detailed the scale of Nazi crimes against Poles and Jews, aiming to raise awareness and pressure the Allies to intervene. The report's content spread through the resistance networks and fueled pleas to bomb railway lines and the killing facilities within Auschwitz, hoping to save lives. Despite its importance, the Allied response was frustratingly muted. Military officials debated the technical feasibility and morality of bombing Auschwitz, concerned about the high risk of killing prisoners and indiscriminate air raids. Political priorities focused chiefly on defeating Germany militarily over mounting humanitarian interventions. Though limited bombing occurred near Auschwitz targeting industrial plants, a direct strike on the camp was never ordered. Nonetheless, Pilecki's report and subsequent testimonies, the Verbal Wetzlar Report and others collectively known as the Auschwitz Protocols, became foundational documents exposing the Holocaust to the world. They shaped post-war trials, influenced public understanding, and remain a testament to the courage of those like Pilecki who risked everything to bear witness. The report was not published fully until decades after the war, with the first English translation appearing in 2012, yet its impact is enduring. It stands as the seminal military intelligence from inside Auschwitz, a voice from within the abyss that shook London, challenged silence, and affirmed the grim truth of one of history's darkest chapters. After surviving the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz and making a daring escape in April 1943, Witold Pilecki returned to the fight with relentless determination. Rejoining the Polish underground resistance, he continued the struggle against Nazi occupation, playing a pivotal role in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, an epic but ultimately doomed attempt to liberate the city from German control. His commitment embodied the spirit of defiance that had sustained him through years of captivity and loss. Following the war's end, Pilecki sought to document his experiences in full, compiling detailed reports to inform the world and history about Auschwitz's atrocities and the broader political shifts overtaking Poland. However, the victory over Nazi Germany was overshadowed by a new threat. As Soviet forces imposed communist rule over Poland, Pilecki's staunch anti-communist stance made him a target of the new regime. In 1947, Pilecki was arrested by the Communist secret police, charged with trumped-up allegations of espionage and treason. Subjected to a brutal interrogation and a kangaroo court, he was condemned to death in a show trial that disregarded truth and justice. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed in Mokotów prison in Warsaw, silencing one of the most heroic and courageous voices of World War II. Pilecki's tragic return, in which the liberator became a victim of political oppression, remains a poignant reminder of the complexities and cruelties in the post-war order. His sacrifice was not forgotten, however. Decades later, as Poland regained freedom and historical wounds began to heal, his legacy was resurrected as a symbol of bravery, truth-telling, and unwavering commitment to justice. Pilecki's death marked the cruel final act in a life defined by extraordinary courage. The only known man to volunteer for Auschwitz, survive, escape, and continue fighting for his country and conscience until his last breath. His story resonates as a tragic testament to both the costs of war and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. ## Part 14, The Tragic Return. After surviving the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz and making a daring escape in April 1943, Witold Pilecki returned to the fight with relentless determination. Rejoining the Polish underground resistance, he continued the struggle against Nazi occupation, playing a pivotal role in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, an epic but ultimately doomed attempt to liberate the city from German control. His commitment embodied the spirit of defiance that had sustained him through years of captivity and loss. Following the war's end, Pilecki sought to document his experiences in full, compiling detailed reports to inform the world and history about Auschwitz's atrocities and the broader political shifts overtaking Poland. However, the victory over Nazi Germany was overshadowed by a new threat. As Soviet forces imposed communist rule over Poland, Pilecki's staunch anti-communist stance made him a target of the new regime. In 1947, Pilecki was arrested by the Communist secret police, charged with trumped-up allegations of espionage and treason. Subjected to a brutal interrogation in a kangaroo court, he was condemned to death in a show trial that disregarded truth and justice. On May 25, 1948, Witold Pilecki was executed in Mokotów prison in Warsaw, silencing one of the most heroic and courageous voices of World War II. Pilecki's tragic return, in which the liberator became a victim of political oppression, remains a poignant reminder of the complexities and cruelties in the post-war order. His sacrifice was not forgotten, however. Decades later, as Poland regained freedom and historical wounds began to heal, his legacy was resurrected as a symbol of bravery, truth-telling, and unwavering commitment to justice. Pilecki's death marked the cruel final act in a life defined by extraordinary courage. The only known man to volunteer for Auschwitz, survive, escape, and continue fighting for his country and conscience until his last breath. His story resonates as a tragic testament to both the costs of war and the indomitable strength of the human spirit. Witold Pilecki's mission was unlike any other in history, a voluntary descent into hell to bear witness, organize resistance, and deliver truth from the heart of Nazi darkness. His legacy endures not only in the intelligence his reports provided to the Polish underground and Allied powers, but in the timeless testament of courage, sacrifice, and unyielding moral conviction. Despite being silenced by political oppression in post-war Poland, his story has inspired generations worldwide. Pilecki symbolizes the extraordinary capacity of one individual to challenge overwhelming evil with resilience and hope. The Pilecki Institute today preserves his memory, promoting education about his sacrifice and the broader horrors of Auschwitz, ensuring the voices of those imprisoned and murdered are never forgotten. His courage foregrounds the importance of bearing witness, reminding humanity that in the face of genocide and tyranny, silence is complicity. Pilecki's life exemplifies how a single act of defiance, volunteering for imprisonment to ignite a resistance within Auschwitz, can shape the course of history by revealing truth when the world yearns for it, but is reluctant to see. From Warsaw's underground to the halls of modern memory, Witold Pilecki's forbidden mission echoes as a call to conscience, urging vigilance against totalitarianism, honoring those who resist, and never allowing humanity to forget.